I think it's a very easy story that maps perfectly onto our psychology already, which is that modern humans are some sort of a fallen species. So of course it just makes sense that we're burning fossil fuels that are destroying the planet, and every storm is getting worse because we are somehow sinful as modern humans, and we need to go back to the way things were. Even though if you start to really study this stuff, the way things used to be is that life was short and cold and brutal and full of toil, and then you died, right? And so we don't really have a context as modern humans of how hard life used to be. And so every day when you turn on the news and there's a wildfire or there's a hurricane or there's flooding, and the news insinuates it's because of climate change, why would you question that? Like, you don't have a reason to. And the only reason why I ever did was because I was so enmeshed in the movement for so long that I started to see the cracks myself.
You must be some kind of therapist.
Today I have the pleasure of speaking with Lucy Biggers. She's a former climate activist who now makes content to calm climate anxiety. She's also the head of social media at the Free Press. Lucy, thanks so much for joining me. Great to have you.
Thank you so much for having me on.
So after 180-something episodes of this podcast, I've never talked about climate anxiety before, which is really surprising if you know that part of my background, which I'll share in a little bit, because at one point in my life, climate anxiety had a huge impact on me. And it's something I haven't revisited in many years. And so when I saw your content, I was really struck by it. And I thought, this is obviously an issue that means a lot to a lot of people. And so maybe we could start off, if you wouldn't mind sharing your story arc, how you went from being an activist trying to raise the alarms about the climate to someone trying to actually soothe people's worries about the environment.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me on. So I'm 35, so I think that's important for just the context of how old I am and my generation, just being an average millennial. And I grew up in high school. We sort of learned about the Inconvenient Truth with Al Gore, which was sort of my first introduction to the climate. I was 16 when I watched that. And that was a huge movie for people who are younger who don't know about it. It was sort of a phenomenon. And that was my first introduction to climate. It really scared me. I remember having an overwhelming feeling of existential dread and then kind of going, I'm not going to think about that anymore, and pushing it out of my mind, but kind of in the back of my mind going, the planet's not in a good place. Then cut to my 20s, I became a video producer at a news company in New York City called NowThis News, which millennials of my age know it, but it was a very popular Facebook first video company. And we had millions of followers. And while I was there, I just started watching climate documentaries. The ones that came out around that time was Leonardo DiCaprio's Before the Flood. There's also Josh Fox films that were coming out. And also there was the Dakota Access Pipeline protest, which was a protest against an oil pipeline in North Dakota. Also, it was called Standing Rock. So as a producer in that newsroom in the 2010s, this is now 2015, 2016, I was consuming content about climate change, and then I was covering these protests. And so from that, I just became part of the climate movement and just sort of took it whole cloth, everything that these documentaries that I was watching were pushing, which now I realize were not the whole story. A lot of it was projections about what could happen because of climate change, right? We could see 7 feet of sea level rise. We could see crop failure. We could see extreme weather every year. And I thought that that meant that those things were going to happen. And so I thought it was an existential threat. And so I dived in all the way, becoming an advocate. I call myself now a climate activist in a newsroom. So I was still technically a news producer for my company, but the way that I covered climate change was very biased. One example would be that when it is probably 2017, 2018, all these newsrooms, I don't even know which ones off the top of my head anymore, sort of saying climate crisis instead of climate change. They just said that all of a sudden. And so I said to my newsroom, we've got to do that too. We've got to start calling it the climate crisis. I didn't say that because I saw that deaths were going up from climate change. I didn't say that because extreme weather was worse, and as if I was even looking at the data. I wasn't looking at anything. And so I lived like that for 5 years in my 20s. At that same time, had climate anxiety, never diagnosed who diagnoses these things, but just this existential dread, essentially feeling very powerless, feeling like I did not have a future, that my life would never be as abundant or as prosperous as my parents' life, that, the world was beyond saving and basically we're on a sinking ship. You can picture the memes we've probably all consumed about this stuff. Every climate event, every natural disaster every year would trigger me. If there was hurricane or anything like that, just glued to the TV watching it, my cortisone levels going up from all this fear. And then I, became 30, 31, the frontal lobe is forming. And which is whatever. People get annoyed with me for saying that, not to be dismissive of 20 somethings. But, I just matured. I started to have more life experience. And I also lived through COVID. I saw during COVID a few things that really put a crack in the climate facade for me and broke up my black and white thinking. One of them was the proliferation of PPE, so the personal protection equipment and it was all plastic masks, dividers, in restaurants, plastic dividers in restaurants. And so I was someone who was afraid to use a plastic straw. And all of a sudden, there's more plastic used in an hour of it a day by any of these businesses than I could even try to save in my lifetime. And at the same time, I looked around and go, well, I guess we're able to absorb this. Like we have all this extra plastic, but it's it seems to be manageable. It's going to go eventually to the garbage, but like it's okay. And then at the same time, our carbon emissions, even with the world shut down completely and everyone's lives stop, schools shut down, businesses shut down, our carbon emissions only went down 5%. And that was when I thought, okay, if the climate movement gets its way, what is it asking of us to give up? And so that was a moment where I thought, wait a minute, is climate change and the impacts of climate change so bad that it's worth basically shooting our civilization in the foot? Because that's what I'm basically saying. And so those are two things, but just over time, many of my doubts started to add up. And in 2021, I got pregnant with my first son and I just changed jobs. I had been in front of the camera at my old job and I changed jobs and it allowed for me to be behind the scenes. And so I said, you know what, I'm not going to post anymore. I have too many doubts about this. It just doesn't feel in alignment with me. And so then from 2021 up until earlier this year, I just was researching, reading different books, on and off. I got my job at the Free Press. And finally, this beginning of the summer, and you mentioned my content that I create now, at the beginning of this summer, I finally said, you know what? I'm not going to be on my deathbed one day looking back with regret that I didn't speak out because of fear. I need to sort of make a decision here. And so I decided to sort of cross the Rubicon and I came out as a climate realist. I'm just very anti-climate alarmism and climate anxiety, which we'll talk more about. But that's my story.
Thanks so much for sharing that. And you painted an image that I can picture of yourself in the early pandemic, noticing what a huge impact the lockdowns and the lifestyle change had on our way of life, including um, a huge change in our ability to socialize, which must have been on your mind as a new or expecting mother, right? Because of the importance of social connection and raising families. And then you're going, wait a minute. So what exactly are the demands of the climate change movement? And does it look like this? Does it look more extreme than this? What and that's very relatable.
Yeah,
So
it's sort of where the rubber hit the road.
I wanted to share a little bit about my background that I haven't shared on this podcast before, but this is really the perfect place to share it, which is that I was actually very much a climate alarmist for much of my life. I think for me, it came from, for one thing, growing up in an overwhelming city. I grew up in LA and
Yeah.
not in a certain neighborhood of LA where I could stay within that neighborhood either. I was all over the city, constantly exposed to so much pollution. And you're in this desert pumping in water from thousands of miles away, and there's trash everywhere, and it feels grimy and there was so much about my experience of the city, plus some of the more apocalyptic events of my childhood, like being present for the riots, for example, that I think made me very susceptible to any type of alarmism. Like if you'd told me
Yeah.
the world is ending, I would have believed you because it sure felt like that in so many ways. Um, and then I got involved in radical activism as a teenager, partly as an outlet for angst and some of the things that had happened to me. I was angry at the world. And so I was very susceptible to extreme ideas. And I think I was always seeking good and looking to do good with my life. And so when it came time to choose a major, I chose environmental studies.
Mm.
And prior to that time, I'd volunteered for a sustainability organization. I'm about 5 years older than you, so, when you were in high school watching an Inconvenient Truth, I was in college watching an Inconvenient
Right,
Truth,
right.
and we had, I remember the shift. Do you remember the push from incandescent to compact fluorescent light bulbs?
Yes, yes.
Like, I was volunteering to teach people to use CFLs, which
Right.
I now hate fluorescent light because I'm a big health nut, and I'm all about switching back to incandescent.
That's
Um,
hilarious. Well, my equivalent of that was pushing everyone to not use plastic straws.
yeah.
So we all have our generational like environmental thing. Oh God. We should be having incandescent. We can talk about it more, but incandescent, can you even buy those anymore?
It's very hard to find good incandescent, plus there's a lot of fake incandescent that are actually, like, LED made to look like incandescent, but
Mm.
yeah, no, the hardest thing to find are those GE reveal bulbs, which is a type of halogen, I think, that are really nice, but anyway, I was part of that, like, "Everyone change your light bulbs to save the world," and but then, learning about how the fact that the CFLs, unlike the incandescent bulbs, contained heavy metals, so they had to be disposed of in a particular way, and then learning about the
Right.
environmental cost of solar panels, and, it's like and so for me, as first an activist and volunteer and then an environmental studies major for my undergraduate, I lived with a lot of climate anxiety. In fact, I would cry in class, like, we'd be learning all this doom and gloom stuff, and I would get all emotional,
Oh my
and I
gosh.
didn't know how my peers were so able to stay logical about it. And, is it any surprise I went into psychology instead after I did take some psychology classes in my undergrad, but I think that the scale of learning about environmental devastation, was so overwhelming for me, and it came to, like, what can I do? And working one-on-one gave me more of a sense of agency. But I think that the climate alarmism, um that sense that the world is ending and we only have a few more
Right.
years, and also the sense of I'm supposed to be waking everyone up. Everyone wake up. You need to go vegan. You need to, put on low flow shower heads. You need to start biking. I was biking everywhere instead of driving. All like it makes you feel very distant from your fellow human beings.
Mm.
And it's part of the reason I never had my own children. I'm a stepmom now, which
Mm.
I've talked about, on this podcast before, but so I'm actually curious because when we look at one of the things we'll talk about today is the impact of climate anxiety on people's worldview, relationships, and decision making. And I'm actually curious how you came to decide to have a family, given that, the beliefs that you held at the time with your understanding of the environment could have easily made you feel like this wasn't a safe place to bring children into the world or that children are too much of a burden on the environment.
Yeah, I think it's really hard to live with that mindset. And for me, it was sort of having to live a double life because I would show up to work and have to, and really obviously believe everything that I was saying. But then as I sort of matured and started to have some cracks in it, I felt like a hypocrite. So in my timeline, my son was born in 2022. So it was like COVID and then that. So by the time I was pregnant with my son, I actually I found out I was pregnant the day that I took a new job that left my old company before. But I had a while there where I was trying to I was thinking about getting pregnant. I was like, should I do a sustainable baby series? Like, which is a nightmare to think about. Like, don't look at my
Consequences.
footprint now. Yeah. And so I think for me, I am very naturally an optimistic person, and that's something that I've come to really accept. And but most of my life, the messaging that I got was to be optimistic is to be naive or to be have your head in the sand, or it's a privileged position to be optimistic. And so I even when I was part of the climate movement, my series was one small step. So it was one thing you could do to impact the climate, switch your light bulbs or compost or all these things. And so even when I was in it, I think my nature was more oriented toward the positive side and the builder side and the maker side. And so even if I wasn't admitting it to myself when I first decided to start to have kids, that was always kind of where I was gonna go. Because I never, even when I was like wallowing in it, I was always trying to like take action, I guess. There's worse cases of climate anxiety out there than I think I had, but I'm very sympathetic now to the mindset wherever it is in the spectrum, whether it's someone who's protesting and, like you're saying, years of your life really in darkness and overwhelm, or just even the average person who don't necessarily think about it every day, but they have this subconscious belief that the world is going to burn. So yeah, I think moral of the story is that I was able to still sort of keep this in this contradiction of being really invested in the climate, but then in my personal life making steps towards having kids and all these things. But I know for a lot of people, and it sounds like your experience, not everyone does that, which is very frustrating to hear, because we can get into more of the science and things that I've learned, but really I don't believe now that climate change is something to be afraid of at all.
Well, I'm glad that between your optimistic temperament and whatever was positive about your upbringing and um, the way that I guess the timing of events in your life, that uh, the climate alarmism that affected your youth didn't stop you from having a family, and isn't creating in you a fear-based approach to parenting, because I think that that is a genuine problem for a lot of people that, either would want to have a family but feel like they shouldn't be taking up resources on the planet, that the world isn't a safe place to raise kids, and I feel sad for those who sort of discover that too late, that maybe they were
Yeah.
looking through a very dark lens. For me personally, it was too overwhelming to try to keep up with this really macro level stuff when my natural inclination is to focus more on intimate personal things, and so I've just kind of left the climate issue alone for many years, and I guess my attitude towards anything that I am not deeply familiar with and really keeping up with is I don't know about that, and there are people who know more about it than me. And of the people who know more about that than me, there are people very strongly on all sides of the issue. Um, so tell us about, I mean, before we get into what you've learned that you find helpful to share with people, talk a little bit about the mental health part. Actually, I need to share this. This is
Yeah.
another personal anecdote that connects to the topic of mental health, and this is a psychology podcast. Um, Abigail Schreier interviewed me for her book, Bad Therapy. And I was so excited to talk to Abigail Schreier. There were all these things I wanted to talk about during our conversation, but she didn't even tell me before the interview that it was for a book. I just thought that she just wanted to get to know me. So then she shows up to the interview, and she's a, very efficient journalist, so she was asking these really pointed questions. And I didn't get to talk about everything I wanted to talk about, but she did ask about my thoughts on why the younger generation's mental health is so bad, and
Mhm.
I mentioned climate anxiety. And then
Mm.
I start reading her book a couple years later, and she uses a scornful and mocking tone about therapists who believe that climate anxiety is affecting the younger generation.
Mm.
And that was one of the things that made it hard for me to get through that book, because I was like, "You know what? I actually stand by that." Like, I had personal experience of climate anxiety having a huge impact on my own mental health, my behaviors, my decisions. I mean, I used to be paralyzed in the grocery store just shopping
Right.
for a can of beans because I had been taught to do a life cycle analysis of every item on the shelf.
Oh my god.
So, that it was something I personally understood. It was actually part of what drove me to study psychology, is how it affected me and the people around me. And as I guess just given the kind of demographics of the types of people that I worked with, I had seen climate anxiety in people. So I was like, "Wow, Abigail, that's
Yeah.
from our interview."
Well, I
So
think
that's the first.
no, but that's interesting because I think what she meant what her perception of it was, are the therapists pushing climate anxiety on the kids, versus you're saying they're coming to me with climate anxiety. Not that they should have it, but that they do have it.
Yeah, and there's, somewhere between therapists pushing an ideology and therapists simply being receptive to
Right.
what their clients are saying is, what about when a client brings a fear that the
Right.
therapist also shares?
Mm,
And, it's not necessarily that the therapist is driving the agenda, but if the client is saying, "Wow, it really feels like we don't have much time left on this earth," and the therapist is reading the exact same news sources,
yes. Yeah.
um, I do think there's some gray area in there with any ideological or political issue, and I've been on many sides of many issues. I mean, I've been
Right.
on both sides of many issues like that. So, and I appreciate you sort of steel manning her case a little bit there. I think the
Yeah.
impression that I got is that climate anxiety isn't real. It shouldn't be treated like a real thing. And I want to talk about what about the kids for whom it is? Like what is
Yeah.
the psychological experience of growing up feeling like the world is ending or like your
It,
species is a
yeah.
burden on the planet?
It is real. It is real. I think the way that the media covers it is the way the media acts in general. I don't know if you think this too, but it's so anti-human. It's so anti-progress. It's anti-West. So it's sort of starting from this assumption that we're the worst, and everything is built out from that. And so you can see that with any topic across the spectrum, but just specifically with climate change, how I think this shows up is that it's almost like the way that we live is inherently bad, and there's this sort of presumption that the noble savage, or the less pop like the like less developed man, was somehow more pure than us, which is a stereotype that can go back to ancient Rome. Like, intellectuals had the same perception, right? So this is not a new pattern for humans, but with the people in the media newsroom, they're New Yorkers and they're in LA, like you're saying, that's where you grew up. They've never probably hunted, they've never been on a farm, they don't really know anything about nature other than maybe when they go on a hike in a preserve or something like that, or on a vacation. And so I think it's a very easy story that maps perfectly onto our psychology already, which is that modern humans are some sort of a fallen species. So of course it just makes sense that we're burning fossil fuels that are destroying the planet, and every storm is getting worse because we are somehow sinful as modern humans, and we need to go back to the way things were, even though if you start to really study this stuff, the way things used to be is that life was short and cold and brutal and full of toil, and then you died, right? And so we don't really have a context as modern humans of how hard life used to be. And so every day when you turn the news and there's a wildfire or there's a hurricane or there's flooding, and the news says it's because of climate change, or insinuates it's because of climate change, why would you question that? Like, you don't have a reason to. And the only reason why I ever did was because I was so enmeshed in the movement for so long that I started to see the cracks myself. Just like any topic, I'm sure the way that the news covers psychology is so irresponsible, right? They're showing studies that are not repeatable, or there's headlines that are really fear mongering. Like, I think a good exercise for people who maybe are listening to this podcast for the first time is, what topic do you know really well at home? And does the media cover it well? And the answer is always going to be no, because the people who are in these newsrooms they're not experts in everything. They don't know what they're talking about. And so with the climate, it's just the same thing. For the last 30 years, we've just been told that the planet is burning and it's our fault, and everything stems from that. And why would you question it?
So I'm going to say something that I don't in any way to expect you to agree with, because you're just a new guest. Welcome, very glad to have you here, and I have no idea where you stand on these issues. But I'm going to share my perspective. I'm actually a new Christian, so I've recently become a Christian. It's been something that's been in progress for a long time. I can say that in retrospect. Um, but I'm just thinking, I'm hearing what you're saying through that Christian lens, and one of the things that brought my faith together for me is recognizing that much of my life I have been sort of experiencing a longing to return to Eden, a longing to
Mm,
return to this
mhm.
original state of perfection. It's part of my attraction to natural beauty, that sense that most of us have of longing for the perfect garden. And I sought that in so many ways, including as an environmental activist. I was seeking that perfect state before the fall, before sin, before separation, before evil came into this world. And so for me, the biblical understanding of the nature of good and evil has actually been really helpful in contextualizing some of these inclinations because the thing that you describe of, we're a fallen species living in
Mhm,
sin, that
mhm.
actually resonates, but I think for me personally, having a spiritual understanding of that and then recognizing, okay, this is life east of Eden. This is life after the fall, and our longing for perfection does tell us something about our nature, um, but some of our attempts at recreating that can also be misguided, right? If we're
Right.
trying to create a perfect world in a world that cannot be perfect, we
Right.
will we will encounter this frustration. And so I think any type of sort of zealotry or idealism or extremism maybe has that little grain of truth in it where, there is some instinct, some compass in us that tells us that a more perfect world is possible, but I see that instinct
Right.
as misguided.
Yeah, I agree with you. I have been thinking about the same exact theme for a while as well, and I was born Christian culturally, right? And went to church every Sunday and was in the choir and all those things, but I never was really had a faith. And I really started to study that this past year and get back into it and commit to actually having faith and learning about what is this whole like Bible thing, when we're all kind of so like learning more about like you're saying original sin and Genesis and like the leaving of Eden and all of that. And so I think you're so right that there are themes there, and I see those themes as well. And I think it goes back to like the way that the human mind is made, or like our subconscious or our souls, or the messaging that we get about Christianity from the moment that we're born. And so that's why it resonates so much, because that is such a universal experience, at least in the West, in the modern industrial world that we occupy. Those themes are there, and I think, like, again, yeah, the road to hell is paved with good intentions is basically my favorite expression. And people who are trying to bring about communism, they thought they were bringing heaven on earth, and leads to millions of people being killed with the climate movement. I mean, we're not seeing that, but I think if we were to do everything the climate movement wanted in the name of, somehow saving the planet, it would actually create so much death and destruction, just because we're so reliant on the modern world that we live in, cheap, abundant energy right now, which is 80% of that is fossil fuels. And so I agree with you. I'm very wary of anything that's trying to bring heaven onto earth. I think what we are craving when we want that is we really want heaven. Like our souls are craving going back to heaven where we came from. But I then maturing and being a human long enough, you realize like, okay, well, we're never going to create like quote unquote heaven on earth. We have to be realistic about the systems that we can work in. And so for me, that means, okay, let's get as much cheap and abundant energy to as many people as possible. Like I want sub-Saharan Africa, they should be able to have access to cooking with natural gas if they so choose. And they should be able to develop with it so they could have these like lives that we have, which are so full of abundance, like, with DoorDash and washing machines and grocery stores and everything, and cars. And so, yeah, I mean, those themes are there. And I think when you get into activism without a foundational faith, you're trying to find that faith in that activism. And that's a theme that's very relevant. And it happens with all the types of activism that we've seen in the past, the pro Palestine, trans stuff. And I don't know if you're familiar with Michael Schallenberger's work, but he has talked about that a lot. That, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. So this idea of like the dogma, and yeah. So, I mean, I agree with you 100%.
I'm really glad I took a chance on sharing that. You resonate, right? I think the myth of the noble savage, which I also believed in at one time ago.
Yeah.
So and it's just one of those kind of misguided attempts to connect with some original state of perfection. But this talk about wanting more abundance for the world. So it sounds like you realized at some point as your climate activism was falling apart that there were ethical issues in idealizing the noble savage and in holding the belief that our way of life in the civilized Western world is sinful, that it is harmful to the environment. In holding that belief, there are some contradictions that come up that don't have easy answers. Like, for example, what should we in the first world want for people in the third world or developing countries? What should we want for them? Right. And so
Right.
you see now that you want cheap, abundant energy. Tell us about how you arrived there.
Yeah. So one of my influences and inspirations is Alex Epstein, who wrote the book Fossil Future. And he also wrote The Moral Case for Fossil Fuels. And he's been on this now for over a decade. And he is a philosopher by nature. And he said he just started realizing that when fossil fuels are so demonized in our culture. And even if you don't have a hard held belief, you just kind of think, well, they're kind of bad. We should age them out. But when you really look at what the role that they've played, they've lifted billions of people out of poverty. Because before we had fossil fuels 150 years ago, when they kind of started, we were killing whales for whale blubber to light our kerosene, like, or to light our lamps, right? So we were not exactly like protecting the environment when we were like making whales go extinct. And then also energy was just so hard to come by that a lot of the labor in a home was the energy expended by that of the woman. So the woman is the one going and collecting wood and then creating a fire and hand milling grain and all this physical labor that now we outsource to machines. And so what happened with fossil fuels was the first energy source to really do this at scale. And there'll probably be more in the future. There's nuclear fission and fusion, which probably could get there for us. Basically, it made all of a sudden energy so cheap that we could create more and more complex machines that could do more labor for humans, and it freed up more human minds to innovate and to invent. And so you see this really interesting hockey puck stick up and to the right that all happened at the same time. Fossil fuel use, which also is our carbon emissions, our GDP, our population growth, and our life expectancy. They basically can all be mapped on top of each other, because when you had the first piece of the puzzle there, which was cheap, abundant energy, you have now a tiller that's powered by fossil fuels tilling the land. So now instead of having 100 people work X amount of acres, you have 2 people. And then those people that were working in the land, they have food that they can now do other things. So we create more complex systems across, the world, beyond just these we would see little nucleuses of civilization throughout history. But what fossil fuels did was just bring it global in a way we'd never seen before. And then you have things like the penicillin being invented, because you have more people who have more time to investigate and to invent. And so the way that Alex talks about it is there's the empowered world, which is what we think of as the first world. But for us, I'm washing my dishes in a dishwasher, and my clothes are in a washing machine. And so I have a lot more free time. And then there's the disempowered world, which is still sub-Saharan Africa, parts of India, Asia, where the women are still doing a lot of physical labor. And so they're working 40 to 50 hours a week, feeding their families, collecting fuel, doing everything by hand. And so if you live in that setting as a woman, you're not getting an education. Why would you can't. We need you doing work around the house. So to me, as someone who cares about human rights and about women having access to education and all the things that progressives say that they care about, it sort of sounds like this sort of edgy thing to say, well, fossil fuels will get you there, right? But it's actually true. And ultimately, we should have another form of energy that can come down the pike, but wind and solar don't have the same, they're not, wind and solar are not as versatile as fossil fuels. So you can't just like put wind into the tank of your car. You have to have the big windmill that goes to a battery, so it's just like way more complicated. So fossil fuels as they are today are the most scalable and versatile and affordable. And so I would love to see something change. But in the meantime, I think it's important to kind of count where we can count wins. And I think fossil fuels, the benefits far outweigh the side effects, which is the climate change, which we're talking about a little bit. We haven't talked about it a ton, but we are seeing some warming from climate change. It's about 1.3 degrees over the past since 1850. But we can talk about more too, is that even with that warming, it's not that we've seen it get dangerous for humans, which I think is a huge piece of the puzzle we can talk about.
That does sound important, but I have to ask, while you're talking about fossil fuels, what about the fact that they're running out and that our methods of extracting them are becoming more toxic, like fracking, for example? Many of you listening to this show are concerned about an adolescent or young adult you care about who's caught up in the gender insanity and therefore at risk of medical self-destruction. I developed ROGD Repair as a resource for parents just like you. It's a self-paced online course and community that will teach you the psychology concept and communication tools the families I've consulted with have found most helpful in understanding and getting through to their children, even when they're adults. Visit rogdrepair.com to learn more about the program and use promo code SOMETherapist2025 at checkout to take 50% off your first month. That's rogdrepair.com.
I think that no matter what, we're going to have an impact on the planet, right? We can't not have an impact. And for me, the benefits that fossil fuels bring outweighs the cost that they do have on the environment, where we do have to disrupt the environment to extract them. Like you said, solar panels have the same thing. Wind turbines do too. You could argue about how and when, which is worse, but I think I would rather have an empowered world of people who can, live in modern societies that are full of choice and opportunity and different. You have the ability to follow your dreams. That's not something you can do in a world where you're just collecting fuel all day. So yes, I think that there are impacts that we're going to have no matter what, but I think it's still, it's the price you pay for the modern lives we live in. And I think that that's okay. Everything has a trade-off. And in regards to it running out, I just, we always think we're running out of stuff. And then, 30 or 50 years later, you look at whatever that thing was, and we have more of it than we did before because we discover something. So for fracking, even though it has an environmental impact, like you said, we didn't even see that on our radar. We thought we were running out of oil. Then we came in with fracking for natural gas. And then natural gas actually has way less carbon emissions than coal. And so I can't predict the future, but human ingenuity has always shown that we are really good at finding the resources that we need and making them more cheap and abundant and available than in the past. That's just been always our pattern.
So it sounds like you couldn't give a number with confidence as to how many more years of fossil fuels we have ahead of us because of that.
Oh, I mean, I've asked people this who are smarter than me. I even asked people at Chevron when I met them. I'm like, how many more years? And they were like, maybe 100, but probably even less. Because there's going to be think about what 100 years ago was. We didn't have the internet. I think we were just getting the car, and we had electricity maybe 130 years ago. And look at us now. We're at such exponential growth. So I think it's going to be somewhere 100 years or less. But what would happen, I think, first is the electrical grid could go nuclear, but then you would still use gas for your cars.
Tell us about nuclear.
So I'm not an expert on it. I can't. It's not my area of expertise.
You're pro-nuclear?
So yeah, I am pro-nuclear. My understanding of it, which is not I don't talk about it a lot because it's not one of my areas of main interest and expertise. But basically, if you look at the chart of how much resources are needed for coal to wind, solar, whatever, nuclear is minuscule. And so it's actually truly clean energy. There's been some really bad nuclear power plant failures. And obviously there was nuclear war threats in the past that made people very afraid of it. It was one of the things environmentalists used to fight. But now the fears are basically overblown. But the problem is that the regulations on nuclear, especially in the United States, are so bad that it's an exorbitant cost to build a new nuclear plant. And so that's hopefully changed. The tide's definitely turned on that, where people are more open to nuclear. But I think it has a lot of promise. It's just not you're not going to be putting nuclear fuel into your car. You would get, I guess, then an electric car that you would charge on nuclear energy, which would be powering the electric grid. So I think we're going to see an explosion of that in the next decade. And people who are smarter than me and experts on that know more than me. But I think it's a good thing, and it was unfairly vilified.
What about the issues with the long-term storage? Because it needs to be stored safely for thousands of years, and it just seems like an earthquake could wreak havoc. What have you learned
Right.
about that makes you feel better about it?
I don't think it's I just think it's one of those things where people are afraid of everything stuff they don't understand. Like, I don't think it's as toxic or hard to store as people say. It's really not. I've seen like it's like what a soda can. Nuclear waste for one person's entire energy life is that of a soda can. It's pretty crazy. So I think it's fine. Like I think I again, you have to look at people who know more than me about this, but from what I've understand about it, which is still pretty surface level, the waste stuff is not something to be afraid of.
So, when it comes to our energy future, it sounds like what you imagine the most likely scenario is that we gradually transition more and more of our electrical grid to nuclear,
Mhm.
and that the decline of fossil fuels doesn't create a crisis.
Yes, exactly. And we just need to have more, research and development. And like, I think the issue with activism, like we've seen, like you're saying, like you fought incandescent lights and now you realize they're good. Like I fought plastic straws and now I'm like, well, paper straws are slush and they have chemicals in them. There's always like these things, and like the environmentalists of the past, they fought nuclear, and then it turns out that could have maybe solved a few problems. I'm like so against activism now because it's always very emotional and fear based. And what I'm very pro is the engineers and the research and development and R&D that we need to solve these problems. Like cars weren't brought about because of activists, right? Cars were brought about because someone invented them and then they were a better model that then replaced the horse. And before we had the car, everyone in the newspapers was freaking out because they said New York City was going to be under manure in 50 years. And they were so worried about manure. And what were we going to do about manure? Should we put a cap on how many horses we have? Should we have only one horse per family because there's going to be too much manure? We should tax people, right, for the manure that they're creating. And then it's like, oh, the car was invented. And so I think with climate, I think it's the same thing. I'm humble enough to know that the universe is so interesting and there's so many ways to get energy that we probably haven't even begun to understand, and maybe it's being invented in the lab right now, and it could happen in our lifetime. And like in 1980, could you have predicted the internet or the iPhone or FaceTime? Like, it's just to say that we can't figure this problem out with more invention, but we figured out how to have this conversation over our computers is pretty crazy to me.
Sounds like you have a lot of faith in human ingenuity.
Yes, I do. I definitely do.
And it also sounds like you have some, important data for us, right? You said 1.3 degrees since 1850, and there are some things you've learned specifically about climate change that have really
Yeah.
changed your perspective, and now you actually go out and talk to people about what you've learned to calm their anxiety. So tell us some of those key points.
So I want to shout out all the amazing scientists who I am inspired by, and I follow a lot of them on Substack. You can follow, Roger Pike Jr., Judith Curry. Why am I now forgetting everyone's names? Steve Koonin, who is a former DOE employee for President Obama. Gregory Wrightstone is a geologist. So anyway, there's a many people out there. Dr. Matthew Walecki, who these are the climate realists who have been shouting this stuff for more than a decade. And so I'm really grateful that in my position as a former climate activist, I can sort of be a mouthpiece for their amazing research and ideas and get it to more people because I speak the language of the climate activist. So some of the things that really first made me not have fear, which is the first one is the fact that disaster deaths, so deaths from natural disasters, hurricanes, floods, droughts, all that are down 98% in the last 100 years. So right there, I think is a huge blow to the climate alarmism narrative because we've seen 1.3 degrees of Celsius warming around that same time, but we've seen disaster deaths completely drop off. So we have to break up this idea that warming means danger because I always just made that assumption. I mapped those onto each other, didn't think about it again. Warming, it's different, it's dangerous, but that's not true. So we have the warming that we've seen, and whether that is caused by us and how much of impact we have on the warming, that is something that scientists are still debating. But we do know, we can all agree that since 1850, it's been 1.3 degrees. And then, so there's the deaths are down. So right there, it's like, okay, we're safe. And the reason we're safe is because of all the things I was kind of talking about before, which is just our industry. The fact that like we live in buildings that are with solid foundations and strong roofs and insulation, and we have heating and cooling. We're much more protected from the weather than, someone living in a mud hut. And if a storm comes, our houses are not washing away with the flood. They might get a little bit of rain in the basement, but you're going to be fine, and you're going to be okay. So we are so resilient as modern humans that we are much safer. And so that's why the deaths have just dropped off precipitously everywhere around the globe as we've modernized. Specifically, one area where we've done the best is with drought. So drought used to cause famine. If crops failed before you had fossil fuels in modern shipping, if you had a region that was impacted by drought, people, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, even millions of people could die. And so now with a global food system, you're able to bring in food to places that didn't have food before, or you're able to irrigate. So it's basic stuff, right? You just don't necessarily think about it. Um, Also, just modern technology, when a storm's hitting, where we evacuate versus 1800s, you may not know if a storm's coming, and it's too late to evacuate. But I will say the climate alarmists will say, well, there's more $1 trillion damages. And I say, well, that's just a sign of how wealthy we are. And it just proves my point even more because if you look at the migration patterns of who lives in Florida now compared to, 100 years ago, that population has grown, I don't know, 10x off the top of my head, whatever it is. And there's a lot more mansions in Miami than there were in 1910. So when you have a storm hit Miami, it costs $1 billion because there's a lot more there to destroy. But it doesn't mean that the people who live there are going to die from the storm and they can rebuild like we've seen every time that there's a storm. So that's one thing. We're safer than ever. And then in regards to extreme weather. So when you think of extreme weather, hurricanes, floods, droughts, wildfires, all of those things I just named either have stayed steady or have slightly declined because, or sorry, either there's no pattern has emerged, or even in the case of hurricanes, droughts, and wildfires have actually gone down. And so again, in the year 2000, probably when you were first getting into climate stuff, I know Inconvenient Truth was 2006, but I feel like it was picking up in the year 2000, whatever. They were saying by the year 2020, we're going to be seeing extreme storms. We're going to be seeing floods. We're going to be seeing crop failures, right? By 2020, 2025. Well, it's now 2025. And so I get maybe in the year 2000, we were afraid, but we now have 25 years of data. And so if there was going to be a crazy pattern that would have emerged, we should be able to see it right now. But the fingerprint of humanity on those things, the IPCC, UN scientists say in their own reports, we have low confidence that we're impacting any of this stuff. That doesn't mean that there isn't variable year to year. There's obviously very bad wildfires. We saw one in the Palisades last year. There's bad hurricanes. We just had one in Jamaica a few weeks ago or a week or two ago. Natural disasters happen, but what people in climate anxiety don't realize is natural disasters have always happened. And I think that they have this perception. It's like the earth used to be gentle and now it's scary and dark. And no, it's not. The earth has always been really crazy. And ultimately, what we've seen with CO2 going up and the weather getting slightly warmer is not a more extreme levels of weather at all. So that was something when I learned about the hurricanes not getting worse, I was like, the scales are coming off my eyes. Because if you turn on the news, every time there's a hurricane, we just went through it with the one that was in Jamaica, every single time they cover it, they're like, well, it's because of climate change. It's X, Y, and Z. It's intensifying faster. Like they just have like vague things that they say, like, well, the wind speeds are records of the last 10 years, or like this is the strongest hurricane to hit this island since whatever date. And that gives you the impression that it's unprecedented when like it's just, these things happen. And weirdly, this year, hurricanes was one of the quietest seasons we've seen. I think that Jamaican hurricane was the first hurricane to make landfall this year. And so I thought we were supposed to be having hurricanes every week. Like that was what I thought when I was in the climate anxiety. I don't know if you have those perceptions of you remember what you thought, right? But like I thought we were gonna have a Hurricane Katrina, maybe one or two a season, and actually it stayed completely like normal.
I want to talk about each of those individually. So starting with
Yeah.
wildfires, well, and fires, not all of them wild. So
Well, like yeah, they're like
I have
arson.
I have a family member who lost a house in the Palisades fire,
Ugh,
which
it's awful.
and actually I went to Pali High, so my former high school burned down,
Oh wow.
and my cousin lost a house in Altadena.
Mm,
So it was basically the same fire that spread over a very wide area. I
that's
think people
awful.
traveled on the wind or something, and I think eventually, if I understand correctly, it was revealed to be arson that started
Right.
that fire. It was also at a time of year it was winter, not
Right.
peak fire season. But in the Pacific Northwest, we have some really terrible wildfires that feel very apocalyptic. And I feel like I I'm just one person, but from my subjective, limited perspective, it feels like it has been getting worse.
Mhm.
Um, Now, I don't know how much you know about wildfires in particular, but I hear debate over how much of our wildfire situation in the Northwest has to do with climate change and how much of it has to do with forestry management
Mhm,
practices.
mhm.
Because
Yeah.
lately, we're now in this dark and wet season.
Right.
And in a recent trip through rural Oregon, I was very pleased to see some proactive what are they called? The intentional burns. I saw the forestry management burning
Right.
piles of litter. So for people who don't know anything about what I'm talking about here, it's basically that the problem with wildfires, as I understand it, and tell me if you want to correct any part of this, is that we've always had wildfires.
Right.
Wildfires become more devastating if they're hotter and faster and go higher in the trees. And one
Mhm.
of the things that can contribute to how devastating a fire is has to do with the amount of, um, forest litter
Fuel.
that has
Yeah.
that is built up, and
Right.
so, these controlled burns, that's the word I was looking for, these controlled burns that they do during the rainy season when they know that the rain is gonna put out the fires,
Right.
help with preventing the fires from becoming devastating, and actually, there are some species that require fire
Right,
in
right.
order to even thrive, but those should be sort of low to the ground fires that don't decimate the trees and go all the way up as torches. And so I've seen both types of fires in the Northwest. I've seen the
Yeah.
devastating kind, which really feel very apocalyptic and hundreds of miles away. You can barely breathe the air. And, the entire tree is
So
completely
yeah.
torched. It's just really devastating on the landscape. And then there's also those times you're walking through a forest and you see, oh yeah, there was a small burn that went through here a few years ago. You can see a little bit of black on that tree, but the tree is fine. It just burned the forest floor. So, I've heard that most of our wildfire problems in the Northwest are attributable to how the forests are managed. I'm just
Yes,
wondering if you
yes.
want to chime in on that.
Yeah. So in the US right now, our wildfire acreage is slightly up from the 1980s. So when you're saying, "Oh, it's gotten worse," it's probably possible that it has. But if you look at it going back to the 1920s, it's down by a lot. So I think the numbers are like it's 10 million acres or something are burned now, and it's down from 50 million, which was in 1930s, but it's up from like 5 million in the 1980s or something like that. And the reason why is because up until the 1950s, the Pacific West, it was a lot more, uh, it was not as densely populated. And when we were even like, let's go even back further to like the 1800s, when we have settlers out there settling these places, right? You had cook fires that might start a fire, and you're not putting that out if that starts a fire, right? Because we don't have a fire department. We're just on horseback, doing whatever people were doing. And so you have a lot of wildfires that used to happen. And then you have the modern era where people live in these areas now, where we suppressed a lot in the 1950s into like 1980. We also passed a lot of logging limitations and banning at that same time. And we adopted more environmental protocols, which said just leave the forests alone. Don't do the prescribed burns like you're saying. And so what's happened in the last 20 years ish is that you have people living in more fire prone areas where there hasn't been fires now since the 1950s, and there's a lot more fuel and there's a lot more people, so there's a lot more people starting fires like we've learned. And so that all has sort of worked together to see this slight uptick that is nowhere near historic highs, but definitely up from the past. And yeah, in regards to like whether it's climate change or not, globally, wildfire rates are down 25%, acreage is burned. And I think it's weird because the climate movement has contradictions where they're like, it's making everything so dry and parched, but also flooding has never been worse and there's more rain and water in the air. And it's like, okay, well, which one is it? Because one of those things can lead to more fires and one of them not. But what we're seeing is more CO2 in the air allows more moisture in the air. So you actually have wetter areas. So if anything, the CO2 would be helping dampening the amount of wildfires that we would see. So I don't think, and other scientists that I read don't say that like the conditions are being made worse for climate for wildfire, but the UN scientists will be like, we predict the conditions to be made worse will be 50% higher. And you're like, okay, what are you talking about? So there's a lot of weird like ways that they kind of like fudge it. But I think the forest management, like you're saying, is so important. And there's historic accounts of people when they first came out to the California and the West where there were still Native American populations. And the West Coast would be in smoke every single season because that's what how the Native American tribes were stewards of the land, and they knew that the redwoods needed forest fires to stay healthy, and they would do it themselves so that you wouldn't get the out of control fire that you're talking about. And so we need to go back to that, but obviously it's really hard when you have suburbs in these regions. And like I know as a homeowner, like wouldn't want a fire every spring in my backyard, even if it prevents like a bigger fire, right? So it's just tough. And I think with California, they're going to have to come up with some common sense laws that find time to clear the forest, whether it's through prescribed burns or just taking out shrubs or getting, I don't know, goats in there. Goats could clear some stuff with some eat it, or just that's what the government's going to do. Because obviously we know with the Palisades, that was a man-made disaster essentially. That was not a climate change thing.
You mentioned forestry and logging. And in the Northwest, there's a lot of anti-logging activism, and it is
Right.
really sad when you see clear cuts in the landscape because you'll just be
I
driving
know.
through rural Oregon or Washington, and you look up at a forested hill, and then it looks like someone just took a giant razor blade and shaved
I know.
part of it clean. And what I recall from my environmental education is that clear cuts are pretty devastating. They create erosion. They change obviously they have an impact on habitat for critters. They
Yeah.
disrupt the microbiome, the fungi, and everything. And it was my understanding from that training that sustainable forestry would be a lot more time consuming because instead of just going in with all this industrial equipment
Right.
and just shaving and
Running it
the
down.
trees, it would be selective thinning
Mm,
of the forest.
right.
You still have some old growth and you still have an environment that has many of the characteristics of a natural
Right.
ecosystem, but you're thinning it. Um, but of course, if companies can just go in and cut
Yeah.
a bunch of
Yeah.
wood and, I mean, there's financial pressure to maximize profits. Um, so what's your current understanding of the issues with the logging industry?
So have been reading Patrick Moore's book. He's the founder of Greenpeace, and he is a huge proponent of a regulated logging industry, sustainable logging, like you said, but also incentivizing people to grow it on their farmland. Just grow wood for the purpose of it being cut down as a crop. And so his whole thing is that it's actually the best way to do it because you can end up protecting lands. You can build in these things where it's like X amount of land is going to be for selling and X amount of land will be preserved. I know you can see that with like hunting as well. So I think there's definitely solutions out there, and I would say like I'm really not worried about the US because we've gained a lot of tree cover since the 1800s because where I live in New England now, it's completely covered with trees everywhere. It was clear cut, in the 1800s, and it's all grown back, and we have so many trees now that it's just something that like, yeah, obviously if you have your beloved forest that gets cut down, it's devastating. And I agree with you, like with like I read the book like braiding sweetgrass, which if you know that book, just talking about the importance of old growth. So I'm not trying to be flippant and be like it'll grow back, but I do think that the US has more protected public land where we're not touching these things than any other country in the world, maybe other than like Canada. So I think we should feel good about that. If you ever look at the map of the amount of land that's protected, it's so amazing, and we have a huge gift here. And so the places that have the worst logging are always the places that don't have access to fossil fuels because you have poor people going and cutting down trees. So
Hmm.
we're in a pretty good
Very
spot
alarming.
because yeah, because the tree growth in our country has increased in our lifetimes, I'm pretty sure.
Wow. I
Yeah.
I didn't know
So
that.
yeah, because I mean, it makes sense if you think about it though, because we're not really using the trees for the way that our ancestors would have used them, right? Like where I live in Connecticut now, anecdotally, when you go on a walk in the woods now, there's stone walls crisscrossing in the woods, but it's trees everywhere. And those stone walls used to demarcate different farmlands. So it's just funny that now these are just fully grown with, 60 to 100-year-old trees. So I'm not worried about it. I feel like the planet is very resilient.
That's encouraging to hear. Now let's talk about hurricanes. So you'd mentioned several natural disasters, wildfires, which we just covered. Hurricanes. So hurricanes are one that I'm quite confused about. Now, granted, I've never lived in a hurricane-prone area per se. I did spend some time in Hawaii and remember a pretty powerful tropical storm there once. But I think the main areas that we see hurricanes are warm water areas like Gulf of Mexico, for example. And it was my understanding from my environmental education that when the temperature of the water increases, it tremendously increases the risk. There's like an exponential relationship
Right.
between,
The
um,
superstorm, supercharged.
yeah, and it is my understanding that the water temperatures are increasing. So I'm surprised to hear that you don't believe hurricanes are getting worse. What am I missing?
Yeah, so the hurricane rates, the rate that we have of hurricanes like making landfall or out in sea has stayed steady since 1980, which is when we have modern satellite data. So that's 50 years of data. So going back prior to that, there's some issues because we didn't have satellites. And so you see this sort of slight upward trend from like the 1960s to 1980, but that's because we didn't have all of the data that we have now. So if you just take the 1980 to now, which is going almost to what would that be, 45 years, we don't see that trend. And so this is just, I mean, it's just out there. Like it's just the amount of hurricanes making landfall every year. It's staying the same. It's slightly decreased. If you're like looking at decrease, they'll be like, if this is steady, it's like this. So it's not a crazy decrease. And so I think what the climate scientists were saying back in the year 19 in the 1990s, they're like, a warmer weather, we're going to supercharge storms. But what's happened, and I talked to Dr. Matthew Walecki, who's a climate scientist, about this, and he said that that was what we predicted. But what we're actually seeing is that because the water's getting warmer and the poles are getting warmer, the contrast between the center of the ocean and the poles of the ocean is decreasing. And because of that, because there's less difference in the cold and the warm, you're actually getting less friction. And the friction is where the storms are usually made. And so what's happened is that that's why we're seeing less storms, is because the warming is having this sort of unintended or unpredicted consequence where there's less friction between the cold poles and where we are. And so we're getting less storms to be created. But what the climate scientists will say is that, okay, we're getting less storms each year, but the percentage of those storms, more of them are category 5 and above. So say we're getting like seven hurricanes this season. 4 of them used to be category 5. Now we're getting 6 hurricanes this season, and 4 of them are category 5. So the percentage, there's less hurricanes, but more of them are category 5. So that's where the climate alarmists will say, but higher percentage of them are worse. And so they say less, but they're worse. I guess that's what they say. And my argument is, okay, but less people are dying from them. Like, I don't understand. Like, even if they are getting worse, we are more resilient than ever because of the way that we live. And so even if we were to see a slight uptick, my argument would be the same, which is like, okay, so we're seeing a slight uptick in hurricanes, and what's like we're still able to adapt and survive like we've shown. And so again, and the thing that they say is, well, there's more $1 trillion hurricanes, and my thing is that's because we're richer, and so there's more to destroy, and it's not because hurricanes are getting worse.
Interesting. Okay, so you mentioned global water currents, temperatures, and patterns. And that was another thing I learned about in my environmental alarmism education. So for those who haven't studied this stuff, just the elementary version of it is that water moves around the planet, including in the oceans. There are patterns of how water circulates, and if you've ever, visited the Pacific versus the Atlantic Ocean at the same latitude and wondered why one is cold and one is warm, it has to do with those global patterns. So, for example, on the West Coast, our water is coming down from the north And on the East Coast, your water is coming up from the south. And so our water has been in frigid places, and your water has been basking in the sun. And that's why, you know, Florida water is 80 degrees when California is 65. So, um, that's kind of a rough summary, right? But there are maps you can look at of global water circulation patterns. And what I was taught is that glacial melts, the water melting at the poles, was going to have such an impact that it was going to essentially halt or significantly alter these patterns of circulation, which were going to have devastating impacts on weather, such as hurricanes, as well as aquatic life. It just there's so much downstream of that. So, what would you like to correct or
So this is one of those things where that's a prediction versus an observation. And so I'm always saying again, like we predicted, the climate scientists predicted that hurricanes were going to get worse. And then, but we now have 30 years of observational data that they didn't, or 45 years, right? So I understand like the scientists fear a lot of things where they make up a prediction or like a thesis, whatever you would call hypothesis in science, whatever the thing is. And so I think that is an hypothesis. I talked to Steve Koonin about this, who's a former Department of Energy secretary under President Obama. So he's no like right wing nut. And he said, you know, you could walk around with fear that an asteroid's going to hit the planet, you know, next year, and you can walk around with fear for a very unlikely like black swan event that's going to ruin the environment. And like that to me is what that scenario is. And so can I ever say that the odds of that not happening are zero? No. But would I worry about it based on the odds of it, of the likelihood of it happening? No. But also I think it's really important to look at the historic record of geology going back thousands of years. And Gregory Wrightstone is a geologist who's been writing about this for a long time. And he talks about the climate during the last 4,000 years. And, you know, we've had periods of time where the planet has been warmer and where the sea levels have been higher. And so the glaciers that you're saying are melting, which we've seen melt since the 1600s when we were in a little ice age. I don't know if you know about this, but like we were in a little ice age where the weather was that 1.3 degrees cooler. So we were actually in a very cold period when we started decided that we were going to go into this warming period and start marking it. And it was around the beginning of the industrial age. 1850s is where we started our like clock up, right? But before 1850, we were coming out of this sort of dip, which was a little ice age. And so temperatures were colder. You know, the Potomac in Washington, D.C. was freezing. This is like when George Washington, it was actually during the Revolutionary War. Very cold times. We don't want to be in that time. It kind of sounds very miserable. So we are warmer than that, but we're also the same level of warm as like there was a Roman warm period where we saw the peak of Roman Empire. You know, Julius Caesar, when Jesus was alive, like that time was as warm. And maybe some people say it was a degree or two warmer than what we see today. So the idea that we have this historically unprecedented warm period is not true. And it's all based on, goes back to, you know, the scientist Michael Mann. So he's a big climate scientist and he came up with a hockey stick graph, which said like, we've been like this and we're going to go like this. And he did one study on tree rings and looked at them and from them there to, you know, mapped the the temperature of the earth going back 4,000 years and said we've never been this warm. And for some reason, like, and then Al Gore and Inconvenient Truth used that map of the weather. That's now been peer reviewed and debunked dozens of times by many people, and everyone agrees, unless you're like really bought into the climate alarmism narrative, that we've had warmer periods in the past. And these used to be called, before we were completely bought in on climate alarmism, they were called, these warmer periods in the past, scientists would call them climate optimists periods, because they'd be periods of times where the planet would be warmer about what we are today and civilization would flourish. And so in the past 4,000 years, every time we've seen warmer temperatures comparable to what we have now, civilization, it would coincide with, you know, a burst of technology, a burst of civilizations and all of these things, because warmer weather means you can have better crops that have better bounty every year. So you can support more minds that are in cities who are coming up with the Pythagorean theorem or whatever they were doing in ancient times, inventing gravity. I don't even know. And so this idea that warm periods coincide with something bad is not true. And then this also idea that the Arctic melt that we're seeing now hasn't happened in the past, and those currents didn't change then. It's not going to happen now, I guess I would say. Long story short.
So one of the things you are referencing here is, I believe, called glaciation cycles. The fact that
Yes, yeah.
aside from what gases human activity is putting into the atmosphere or not, that the Earth has its own natural cycles of
Right.
getting warmer and colder. And so, for example, most people remember learning about the land bridge up,
Right.
that from Russia to Alaska, and how that's how
Right.
people got to the Americas
Because that was an
because,
ice age. Right.
yeah, so when there's more when more of the Earth's water is trapped in ice, then the sea levels are gonna be lower, and when, and so those patterns have been going on of ice ages and warming periods and, like you said, mini ice ages. That's been going on for a long time. I can't remember off the top of my head. Maybe you can, let people know what the non-man-made factors are that drive those cycles.
I actually don't know. I think that I don't know. I think the cycles, I don't know. The planet just has its natural rhythms of um I don't know. I think it's even like sequestering of carbon. Like we naturally have plants that sequester carbon, and then you get the lower carbon, and then you get the lower temperatures, and then that kickstarts this ice age. We're really overdue for an ice age right now, is the thing. So there are 10,000 year cycles, and this is good. Gregory Wrightstone, he's a geologist. And I think the geologists are a really interesting antidote to the climate scientists because they're like, we have 800,000 years of temperature records and we know what the planet's been doing. And so you climate scientists are looking at 30 years and you're projecting all these things into the future. But the best thing we can do to an antidote for fear and speculation is to look to history. And so when you're saying the ice age cycles, we have 10,000 year cycles where it will all of a sudden hit a point and for whatever reasons the glaciers start to grow again and we have an ice age. And in the last one, it was so bad it was down to Long Island where so we really don't want that happening again. Where we are right now is actually right at where we should be entering back into an ice age. And there's even theories, again, in the climate realist skeptic world that say the level of CO2 we have is really before we started releasing CO2, we were at 280 parts per million. Now we're like 425 parts per million. 280 parts per million is very low historically. Like I think it was like above 1,000 parts per million when the dinosaurs were alive, and I think it could have even been 3,000. So this idea that like carbon needs to be at 280 parts per million because that's what it was before we started releasing it historically is not true when you look at a longer scale. It is true for like the human life, like CO2 has been low since humans have been around, but the idea that life doesn't thrive when CO2 is higher is absolutely wrong. It's just that we haven't been around to sort of see what it's like as humans. But yeah, I actually don't know why I don't think I don't think there's scientific consensus on what triggers these ice ages when they do happen. So that's a good question. I don't know what it is. Because CO2 I think has been consistently pretty low for the past few of them. So I don't know.
Well, we've been through a few ice ages as a species, right? And that's it just
Yes,
seems clear that
exactly.
the relatively warmer, not as warm as
Yeah.
dinosaur era, but the relatively warmer periods have been associated with more innovation because I would think it just depends on where you live.
Right.
Because right now, I mean, you say there's been 1.3 degrees since 1850, and one of the forms of climate alarmism that we do hear about where there are scary things happening is people who live in very hot places.
Yeah, totally, totally.
Where it's if it's normally 110 degrees in the summer, now it's 120 and people are
Yeah, yeah.
dying. Um, so it would just seem like some of it's based on where you live. And what I hear you saying is not that humans are not causing any degree of climate change, but what I'm hearing is that we're not causing as much climate change and um relative to the total amount of influence on the environment, and that furthermore it might not be a bad thing. Am I understanding correctly?
Yeah, we just don't know. I think like when I asked Steve Koonin this, I was like, well, what do we know? And he was like, what the scientists agree on is that the planet has warmed 1.3 degrees in the last 150 years and that we're adding CO2 to the atmosphere. that is where the consensus ends. And then every statement after that, are we impacting the climate? That's a 50-50 divide among scientists. Like there's not a consensus. Like there's not like a, majority of scientists say, yes, we are. They're still debating that. Then if you go out even further, is it dangerous for us? There's no consensus on that either. And we have this observational data, which I was talking about with the hurricanes and the deaths being down, all that. That observational data is really helping out the climate realists because it's really good. And even you said like people are dying from heat, and like again, that's one of those things where like you see that, I guess, in the news like vaguely, and like sure, it's obviously devastating. Every death is a tragedy, but more people die. Not It's like 6x more people die from cold every year than heat. And so even warming, Bjorn Lomborg's a writer who has written a book called False Alarm on this, and he's another inspiration for me. And he said, climate change has probably saved upwards of 100,000 lives because the warmer weather has prevented cold deaths. And so it's even obviously like if you're in a warmer place, that's not the best news for you, but it's still net over the globe saving lives. But again, you say these things in a certain environment and you're an open-minded person, you're listening to me without being too dug in. But you say stuff like, well, cold deaths kill more, or like fossil fuels aren't that bad. And depending on who your audience is, it can be very tricky. And I can sound like a nut.
Are you a therapist in need of continuing education that's not over-the-top woke? Check out my colleague Lisa Mustard's pod courses. All of her pod courses are approved by the National Board for Certified Counselors. Right now, Lisa is offering my listeners an incredible deal. Get all 27 pod courses for only $44. That could meet almost all of your continuing education needs for the year. Visit lisamustard.com/podcourses and use code SOMETherapist to take $5 off of her $49 pod course bundle. Again, use code SOMETherapist at lisamustard.com/podcourses. I'll include that link and coupon in the show notes for your convenience. All right, now back to the show. All right, so shifting gears, I want to talk about your current activism, because I think how I originally found you was a brief video that you'd shared on X of going out and talking to people at environmental protests or something like that. And in this very friendly and unassuming way, you basically just came up to people and said, "Hey, would you be open to me sharing some information that might give you a different perspective on this?" And the reactions were all so positive, which was almost hard to believe. I'm sure that your reactions are not always 100% positive. But tell us about your work of actually getting out there and communicating with people over these issues and what kind of responses you get.
Yeah, so that was actually my first in-person, taking the information to the people event. So I'm glad that you saw that. That video was really fun to make, and I'm hoping I'll be able to do more of that in the future. But most of my stuff I've been doing is online, so I get comments of that. But yeah, I went to a protest. It was a climate activist march. I went there in September, and I was so scared because I didn't want to come off like a gotcha for them. Like we've all seen the pieces where I didn't want to make them seem like they were fools, because I don't think that they are. I actually think that they're victims, these activists. So I just came at an iPad and had all these different facts that we've kind of talked about, like disaster deaths being down, hurricanes not going up. There's other ones like heat waves have been worse in the past, whatever. And so I just would say to them, hey guys, like I used to have I'm a climate activist. I used to have climate anxiety. I've healed it. Can I show you some of the charts that helped my climate anxiety? And I think just kind of going from that perspective, people were really perceptive, some more than others. I found the people that were sort of like the happy-go-lucky, like part of their environmental club in college, and just kind of there was one group of like 4 kids, 2 guys and 2 girls, and they were so sweet, and they were like, oh my god, like thank you, like this is so great, and they were really perceptive to it. And then there were the more like dug in, like fracking activists, or they have a career of it, or they are not just activists about climate, but they're socialists as well, and they think we have to bring down imperialism. And those people were the ones who fought back more, and seemed a little bit more entrenched and were harder to reach. But I was very heartened by the people who were sort of your more run-of-the-mill environmental activists. And I think we're just there basically because of fear. They might have seen some of the documentaries that I've seen or you've seen, and they were like, because I was like, can I help? Can I help you with this? And they're like, yeah, like I'm so scared.
It seems like you got met with the most resistance from the people whose identities were most attached to their activism and worldview.
Yes, definitely.
And that's not at all surprising to anyone who's familiar with my approach to understanding these types of issues. But I'm curious. I mean, I'm thinking about, I guess, a couple of things here. So one is how we sometimes choose to adopt worldviews, beliefs, social circles, ways of life that match something deeper within. And so I explained how, for me, some of the stress and trauma of my childhood made me a very easy target for any messaging that, the world is about to end and everyone who's not alarmed is stupid.
Mm,
Like, I was very
yeah,
receptive to that message
yeah.
because of who I was at that time and what I'd been through. And when you describe your more optimistic temperament, I don't know anything about your past, but my first guess is, "Oh, she was raised well. She comes from a happy family." You know? And so, given the nature of the work I do, I coach parents of young adults with mental health problems, um, and I look at the trifecta of social contagion, including the cluster B piece, which has a lot to do with identity. So it's this whole identity politics thing, and I'm thinking about, if the information that you were sharing was truly convincing, and it might not be convincing to a listener right now because, you didn't come here with a PowerPoint, you just came to have a conversation, and, there were moments that you said, "I would look to this book to answer that question." It's not, but if you were giving the most convincing talk of your life and you had your PowerPoint with your references and your charts and graphs and things like that, there would still be people who would defend to the death, a stance antithetical to yours, even if they hadn't researched it as well,
Right.
because of how central those beliefs are to their identity and worldview and to the sort of relational structures that sets up between them and the rest of the world, whether it's I'm the self-sacrificing martyr and the rest of the world, is selfish and dumb, whatever that kind of underlying structure is, and then on the other hand, I'm thinking about the people who, like you said, they're sincere, they're genuinely looking for help, they're receptive to your ideas, and I'm thinking, um, those who maybe are, let's say, their beliefs about environmental devastation are potentially in the way of something that they want. Like earlier I
Mm,
mentioned having a family, like someone who maybe wants to have kids but is feeling conflicted because, "Oh, I've been taught that,
right.
humans are such a tax on the environment." So I'm just wondering if you've seen those sort of underlying motivations affect the way that people are receptive to this information.
Yeah, I think that there's the dug in people, like you said, who are more difficult to reach. But what I've noticed, which is surprising, is the messages from coworkers or just people in my personal life who were never activists, never even cared about the environment or thought about it, but they had a subconscious, loosely held belief that the planet was burning. And so those people are the ones who go, oh, so glad I don't have to worry about that anymore. Like they weren't necessarily really worrying about it every day, but kind of just had a little feeling. And now it's one less thing to sort of worry about. So I love that. Or they took a class, they took one class that really stuck with them and then kind of decided to not think about it again. And those people I think are really reachable. And to me, it is a psychological thing where I really care about young people in this prosperous age that we live in, living in reality and understanding the prosperity that we have is such a gift, and so they should be so grateful. And I think it for me, it's sort of this journey from fear ended with the feeling of gratitude because I all of a sudden realized I'm so lucky to be born when I was born, and it flipped every single thing on its head. And so the when I talk about this, that's what I'm trying to help people understand is that we don't live in these unprecedented scary times that everyone talks about. The scariest thing that's going on is our news cycle and our social media feeds. But if you're able to like disconnect and ground yourself and really look around at the abundance that we have, I mean, it becomes more of like a state of mind, like you're only as happy as you're going to let yourself be. Because we all have the makings in front of us. I think if you live in the West and most people who are consuming this content in a certain level like of income and everything, like we have the makings to have whatever life that you want to have. But what's getting in the way right now is a lot of outdated paradigms and fear-based ones that are holding a lot of people back. And climate's just like one of, you can list off others. You work in psychology, so I'm sure you see it all the time. And so my hope is to just clear up the fear where I can with this one specific issue that I know about.
Well, I appreciate that. And I'm very much on the side of young people living in reality. And I almost, I feel like your work really separates the wheat from the chaff because for some, it's not a big leap to have that light bulb moment of, wow, I am so fortunate. I'm so blessed. I have so much to be thankful for. And now I have no excuse for not making the most of the gifts that God gave me and, working hard and creating more abundance in this life. Whereas I think for others, the idea of having that excuse removed is terrifying, right? Because my excuses are keeping me in a victim mentality, allowing me to blame other people. And I also pray for the liberation of those young people who were held back by beliefs that are not based in reality and want the right help and the right guidance for them that, even if some part of your identity is attached to things that aren't serving you, and even if you're getting some kind of emotional satisfaction out of feeling like you're morally or intellectually superior to others who you don't agree with, still there's so much more on the other side of that missing piece of humility, right? That, "Oh, I was wrong, and actually, I'm not a victim, and there's nothing in my way, and I have a lot to be grateful for, and now I just better, like, work hard with what I've been given." Oh, okay. Like, that can feel really scary, but there's still so much good on the other side of it, whereas I see every day just the consequences downstream of not letting oneself go through that sort of ego death of sorts.
Oh my gosh, it's so true. It's so true. And I hope, yeah, I'm working on a book proposal right now. So I'm hoping that if I can get that into people's hands, it could be just a little, you could start prescribing it to your climate anxiety kids.
What's your book about?
It's about basically like the facts to help like calm climate anxiety, essentially. So it's in the works. It's not nothing, but manifesting that. Because I just think, yeah, I want to get this narrative out there. It's not really just about like, oh, don't fear climate change, but it's also like, wow, look at the civilization that we have built. There is so much to be grateful for. Like you said, it's yours for the taking, this life. And so many people are caught in this fear and victim mindset. So that is like kind of the crux of it, is getting people to see all the gifts that we really do have.
And the decisions that we make in our youth about how to view the world and our place in it, they're really consequential in ways that you can barely grasp in your 20s. As I mentioned earlier, they affect your decision to have a family. And
Yeah.
and even whether you're looking for a partner to have a family with or not is going to have a huge impact on your relational health. They affect things like saving money for the future, because if you think that humanity has 10 years left on this planet, what's the point of a savings account? They affect how you treat your health. They affect the dietary choices that you make for many years I was malnourished because
Mm.
I thought that, eating animal products was a burden on the planet.
And that
And
doesn't help
then
your mental health either. The
no,
the no
absolutely
animal
not.
products is not good for your brain.
Oh, I absolutely agree.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I mean, these things are the beliefs that you adopt, especially in your 20s, they really matter. They're super consequential. So, Lucy, thank you so much for the work that you're
Yeah.
doing, reaching out to young people and telling them that things are brighter than they appear.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I really enjoyed the conversation. Thank you.
And so, where can people find you?
So you can find me at Lucy Biggers, which is my Instagram. And then I'm on Twitter, I'm at LL Biggers. And then I'm on Substack. Everything is just Lucy Biggers. I also work at the Free Press, which is awesome news organization. I sometimes publish stuff there or like collaborate with them. But if you were looking for just more journalism that is open to these kinds of ideas, the Free Press is awesome. So definitely check it out, thefp.com.
Okay, great. And I'll share all those links in the show notes. Thanks again for joining me.
Of course. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to You Must Be Some Kind of Therapist. If you enjoyed this episode, kindly take a moment to rate, review, share, or comment on it using your platform of choice. And of course, please remember, podcasts are not therapy, and I'm not your therapist. Special thanks to Joey Pecoraro for this awesome theme song, Half Awake, and to Pods by Nick for production. For help navigating the impact of the gender craze on your family, be sure to check out my program for parents, ROGD Repair. Any resource you heard mentioned on this show, plus how to get in touch with me, can all be found in the notes and links below. Rain or shine, I hope you will step outside to breathe the air today. In the words of Max Ehrmann, with all its sham, drudgery, and broken dreams, it is still a beautiful world.